Welcome back to Historical Projects, a community podcast exploring project success and leadership. I'm your host, David, and today we are stepping onto a cold December battlefield in 1805, one that would become a masterclass in planning, timing, and strategic clarity. This is the Battle of Austerlitz, often called the Battle of the Three Emperors, and we'll look at it not just as a military clash, but as a project. One with a clear purpose, a defined timeline, very complex stakeholders, and a legacy that still shapes strategic thinking today. To help us unpack this remarkable story, I'm joined by David Matthews. Originally an engineer, then an operations manager, and now he teaches physics and mathematics to secondary school students. He brings a passion for history and a wonderful ability to connect the past to the challenges we face in modern leadership and project work. I'm thrilled to have him here. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. I'm very excited to be here.
David, I'm curious to know, why does this story mean so much to you?
Well, David, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. As you know, I have been of history for a very, very long time. I've read lots about history. I've studied a lot of different parts of history. And one of the things that really interested me was in the year 2000, my wife and I trip to Paris to stand under the Eiffel Tower to watch the fire of the turning of the year 2000. Part of that trip to Paris, we also spent time visiting many of the Napoleonic sites in Paris. And that really sparked my interest in Napoleon and Napoleonic history. And I've since travelled to several Napoleonic battles within Europe. I've been to Paris several times. And in 2015, my family and I got the opportunity to the Battle of Austerlitz, visit the battlefield of Austerlitz and spend some time travelling around the area and getting to know the history of the site firsthand.
So, David, you got to tell me, I bet your kids just loved that trip. They would have thought, I just can't wait to tell my friends back home, I've just been to the Battle of Austerlitz. How hard was it, really?
Well, the kids were, I think, 8 and 10, and they hated every single minute of it. I have a wonderful photo of me and the children standing in the middle of the battlefield, right at the point where the Russian commander had been commanding the battlefield. And there's this wonderful photo of myself and my children have the most bored look on their face. And I'm just standing there smiling, going, yay, I finally made it.
David, at our podcast, we are developing a tradition, and our very first podcast was by Allah, and we talked about the history of coffee. I always like to ask people, what is your favourite coffee?
Well, David, that's an interesting question. Living in Melbourne, where there is such a strong coffee culture, obviously most people would expect that everyone who lives in Melbourne drinks coffee. Unfortunately, I don't drink coffee at all. So my answer to what sort of coffee would I drink would be nothing. I do, however, enjoy a good tea. And I wanted to talk to you about a short story that I had regarding a cup of tea that I had when we were traveling in Jordan. So back in the late 1990s, my wife and I traveled through Israel and Jordan for 4 weeks. And as part of our journeys, we ended up in the Negev Desert, which is in the southern part of Israel and Jordan. And we went on a hike, which started very early in the morning, but didn't finish until after lunchtime. By the time we finished walking, the temperature was up around 40 degrees. And the very last part of the hike was to climb out of a gorge that we were in. And so we had to climb up probably about 30 or 40 meters of cliffs to get out of this gorge that we were in. So it was a vertical climb up out of this gorge in 40-degree heat. When we got to the top of the gorge, we sort of came out into the desert and we were like, oh, great. And right next to the gorge was a small Bedouin tent. And so we went into the Bedouin tent. The gentleman in there invited us to sit down on one of his rugs that he had on the ground. And then he offered us the best cup of black tea that I've ever drunk in my life. It was really, really rich, strong tea, but very, very highly sugared, so highly a lot of sugar in it. But it was really, really tasty. And after such a long hike in such hot weather, I was really surprised that a hot cup of tea in the middle of the desert was probably the best caffeinated drink that I've ever drunk.
Now, David, let's start at the beginning. Can you put me in a time machine and take us back to Europe at the start of the 1800s? What was actually happening at that time?
Thanks, David. That's a great question. At the beginning of the 1800s in France, there was two things that was happening. The first was Napoleon was rising to power. So politically, he was rising to power. And in December 1804, he coronated himself at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and became the Emperor of France. At the same time, it was a period of relative peace within Europe and within France. And Napoleon had moved his army to the area in northern France near Bologna. And between 1803 and 1804, he had been training the army with the aim that he was planning to invade Great Britain using the army by crossing the British Channel or by crossing the English Channel. Unfortunately, because of the strength of the British Navy, he was unable to move the army across and be ever able to invade Great Britain. And so what he did was he decided that he would not invade England and that he would turn towards Europe and fight the Battle of the Third Coalition, which was against the British, the Austrians, and the Russians. And so when the when that coalition started in 1805, what he had was a very well trained army. The army was well equipped, it had been well trained for 2 years, and the officers that were in charge of the army had developed a great competency in how to direct and develop and move the army around. So that was the background to what was happening. And so in October of 1805, when the coalition of the Allies was announced, he moved the army very, very quickly from northern France across into uh, Central Europe through Germany and then into Austria. And by early December, Napoleon's Grand Army had marched very deep into Central Europe. And the thing that took the Allies by surprise was the speed at which the army had been able to move across such a large area. The French army was outnumbered by the combined forces of the Russian and Austrian empires, and on paper, it looked as though the French were not in a winning position. But Napoleon had a very important plan. It was one that was built on deception. It was one that was built on understanding the terrain where the battle would take place. And it was also on a really important part, which was a sense of timing. The battlefield of Austerlitz is to the west of, and this was the stage on which Napoleon and the Grand Army would fight the battle. In order to appear deliberately weak, Napoleon abandoned the high ground, which was called the Pratzen Heights, and this lured the Allied army into the trap. The role of this particular project was quite simple. It was to break the coalition allied against France and to secure Napoleon's dominance over Europe. But the execution was anything but simple.
David, you've given us a really good description of the battle. On a bigger picture, what do you see as the role of this battle in Europe, and what do you see?
If we treat Austerlitz as a project, its main role was to achieve a decisive victory for Napoleon that would reshape the political landscape throughout Central Europe. Napoleon needed to win in order to be able to force peace negotiations and to discourage any future coalitions against France, and to also demonstrate the superiority of his newly reorganized Grand Army. So its purpose was not just military, It was also diplomatic, it was also psychological, and it was also symbolic. Napoleon wanted to show Europe that France could not be contained, and he wanted to show that in a way it was almost an inevitable victory, that it was an effortless victory for him and the Grand Army. So if this was a project, it would be a very, very fascinating case study. Napoleon didn't just plan for a battle, he engineered the entire experience on the day. He shaped what the enemy army was thinking and what they were seeing. He shaped what his own troops believed was possible, and he shaped the environment itself using the fog, the terrain, and the timing. And these were all all the tools that he used in this battle.
Amazing. When I think about that, what a communications strategy he used. I could just
Yeah.
imagine all the other generals there going, oh, we've done this, don't you worry about that. And they all walked into his trap. It makes me start to think about arrogance, that
Yes.
often if we're arrogant, we're not really seeing what's going around. We're not really looking at it. Now, David, when we talked about this podcast before now, I was really surprised how short the battle was. I believe it only lasted 9 hours from dawn, December the 2nd, until mid-afternoon. That's not a bad day's work when I think about it. That's very impressive. But I also reflected, like all major projects, the visible execution was only the final phase that we all look at and we all remember. But David, can you share a little bit about all of the pre-work, all the work that happened before they even turned up to the battlefield?
I think there's a few different phases to the pre-work. The first one was the training of the army in the years leading up to the Battle of Austerlitz. There was the forced marching, so they marched very quickly from northern France into Central Europe. There was the intelligence gathering, which meant that his reconnaissance teams were surveying the battlefield, and so they knew where all the strategic and defensive points were. There was the psychological manipulation in being able to get the Allied armies to come to the battlefield. And then finally, there was the careful positioning of Napoleon's troops in order to be able to take advantage of the strategic points on the battlefield. So when the fighting finally began in, as you said, the early morning of December the 2nd, the Allied armies committed heavily to attacking the French army in the French southern flanks, so on the right side of the French army. Napoleon had intentionally set those troops in that area of the battlefield up to appear weak in order to bait the enemy into attacking that part of the battlefield. Once the Russian and Austrian troops were fully committed, he waited until the strategic moment when he then launched his main attack, which was through the centre of the battlefield, and he retook the Pratzen Heights and effectively split the Allied army in two. It was a very effective strategy because it meant that he could then attack the two parts of the army separately and deliver on his main objective, which was to complete a decisive victory. And so by mid afternoon, the Allied forces had been defeated and were in full retreat, and the battle and Napoleon's project had achieved its objectives with very, very remarkable efficiency.
What you've got me thinking about, this was a game of chess, and Napoleon was looking about 7 moves ahead, where the other guys were just looking 1 move ahead. They didn't see the game that was really happening. And again, I don't know why that is the case, because in our projects, it's the same, isn't it? We often look at what's distracting us in that moment, but not realising that there's a whole series of following steps that we need to think about. David, it's an incredible story. And I'm curious to know, what do you think was its legacy? A huge legacy, an incredible battle that changed Europe significantly. What are your thoughts on the legacy?
Well, I think if you look at the conclusion of the battle, David, the results were quite clear. It was a resounding success for Napoleon and the Grand Army. The Third Coalition against France collapsed immediately. Austria sued for peace. The Russians withdrew back to Northern Europe, and Napoleon's reputation as a strategic genius was cemented within Europe. But the legacy of Austerlitz is also more nuanced. It's a symbol of perfect timing, of decisive execution, and it also contributed to Napoleon's own growing overconfidence, something that would, in the end, eventually undermine him. As with many successful projects, the very triumph also created new risks.
Whoa, that's interesting. I know I've worked on projects. Success is fantastic and we all want success, but we sometimes start to believe our own success and we don't see the risks that are starting to appear. And we have this overconfidence, don't we? It's really interesting, I think. David, thank you. We've explored the story of the battle. I didn't know it. I have watched the last Napoleon film and it was so cool. I really enjoyed that. And they talk about the battle there. But what I'd like to do now is, I know you have a lot of experience, 20, 25, 30 years experience on projects. I'd like to now look at this particular case study, looking for modern project and leadership lessons. There are so many hidden in this story. So my first question for you, David, is Austerlitz is often described as a masterclass in timing. Can you recall a moment when timing made all the difference in a project that you led?
I think timing is really, really critical for nearly all projects that you do in the modern times. And one of the key projects that I can think of was a operational efficiency project that I was working on. And at the time, the organization was going through significant change. The industry was downsizing quite significantly. And there was a lot of external pressures which were driving the need for improvements in uptime and operational efficiency within the manufacturing operations that I was working on. And so I think timing makes all the difference to any project. It comes down to knowing what needs to be done, being able to execute that efficiently at the time that it needs to be done. And sometimes if you are too slow or too quick in terms of being able to roll out a project, the timing can be wrong, the execution can be poor, and the project will either end up failing or stalling because you haven't got the timing of the execution correct.
I know when I think of my career, a big moment that helped me understand projects was one of my mentors said, often when we do projects, we get caught up on the costs, but the costs are a given. But timing's critical because the whole business case is based on something being delivered. And the longer the project takes, the more money you spend. And it was a really big challenge for me, David, to realize is that in projects, you actually have to spend money because you need the resources. And it made me understand schedule and timing is critical for project success, as well as costs, as well as scope. But there's no point delivering a project late under budget because you could have missed the opportunity.
Correct. I fully agree, David.
David, what I found fascinating about this story was how all the allies got overexcited, overcommitted, and in hindsight, they actually had the wrong priority. Have you ever seen a team or an organisation invest heavily in the wrong direction? And what did you learn from that?
I think working as a project manager, as an engineer, and as a process improvement manager for several years, David, I've seen several projects and several areas where organizations have invested heavily in the wrong direction. The thing that I've learned from that is it's really, really important to do the strategic thinking up front, to have that aligned with the strategic priorities of the organization, And then once you have the project that you need to execute, it's doing the pre-feasibility work, the concept study, the pre-feasibility work, and the feasibility work to plan and make sure that the direction that the project is heading and the strategic outcomes that you're looking for align with those of the organization. And I've seen several projects where we get to the end of the feasibility work and then we actually stop the projects altogether because they don't align with the new strategic direction of the organization, or they don't deliver the outcomes that we thought they would at the beginning of the project.
What I find interesting is I've worked on project where, I don't know if you've experienced, David, this, it gets momentum and everyone starts to believe, and they believe in this project, but the project's a dog. The idea isn't worth pursuing, but it's almost like people start to create ways to try and justify a particular project that actually isn't going to give the cost benefit. And it takes real leadership, I believe, to be able to stay the course and say no to a project and actually stop it.
And I think that that's an important part of being a strategic thinking manager and leader, is that you can have the courage to say, no, let's stop this. We're going in the wrong direction. We've overcommitted to the wrong priority, and that we need to step back and reassess before we continue on with the execution of the project.
When I think of Napoleon, he is such an influential person through history. And one thing that I believe he was really good at shaping perceptions of himself and the battlefield just as much as the detailed plans. And when I think of perceptions, then I start to think about communication. He was brilliant at communicating to his stakeholders to change their view of a situation and to create a perception or a positive perception of what they were trying to do. David, in the projects you have worked on, have you ever had to manage how others perceived the project or the challenges you were confronting? And what did you do?
So, David, I think, as you mentioned, communication is a real key here. I think that the success of all projects requires a few things. The first thing is obviously a stakeholder analysis. So, who are the key people that we're trying to engage with the project? So, who's funding the project, but also who will be working on the project as you deliver the project. And so, I think a stakeholder analysis is quite important. And then what flows out of a stakeholder analysis is obviously a communications plan. And with a communications plan, what you're doing is you're looking at each and every person that the project will be that needs to be part of the project, and will how you need to communicate with those people. So, do you need to meet with them face to face? Can you communicate with them via email? Can you communicate with them online? What's the strategy for each person? What's their commitment to the project? And then how do you need to communicate with those people? And then once you've got your communications plan and your stakeholder analysis, the next thing is actually going out and executing it. And I think that certainly, as you mentioned, that was one of the key things that Napoleon was very, very good at, was executing his communications plan, not just to his generals and people like that, but also to the soldiers within his army. And I think that on the projects that I've worked on where I've seen success in changing people's perceptions, it's about having a communications plan, talking to people, and then delivering on the things that you're talking about with them. So, delivering on the outcomes of the project, but also delivering on the, I guess, the agreed benefits and the agreed cost savings, or those sorts of things that you're working on for the project. And so I think it comes down to three things. The first one is understanding your stakeholders. The second one is having a communications plan for those key stakeholders, and then going out and doing what you say you're going to do. So when you talk to somebody and you say, this is what I'm going to do for the project, that the next thing is you actually go out and you do that thing as well.
What's interesting about that example is when you deliver, you're seen as reliable. And you do deliver, and then that changes people's perception of you. It then comes with trust. People trust you to deliver. So it's actually, you can't be a spin doctor and just create noise. You need to be able to communicate, change perceptions, and then deliver on it. That's a really good point. David, if you were teaching a leadership workshop, you're teaching people all about leadership, and you wanted to use Austerlitz as a case study, what would be your headline lessons that people will take away?
I think that this period in the Napoleonic history teaches us three things, David. The first thing is that obviously Napoleon's army was very, very well trained. They had spent 2 to 3 years training prior to the battle, and so they were very, very well trained. And I think the training of people within your organization is a really, really important thing. The ongoing learning and training of people is really, really important. The second thing that I think the Battle of Austerlitz teaches us is that Napoleon knew the battlefield very, very well. His reconnaissance and intelligence had given him a lot of information about the strategic points within the battlefield, and he used that to his advantage. And I think that if you compare that to our modern understanding of leadership, it's understanding and having a very, very good understanding of the project that you're working on, the deliverables that you're required to deliver on, and how, as a leader, you can lead your team to deliver on those things. And then the third thing that I think is really important and that the Battle of Austerlitz teaches us is being able to have a good sense of timing. So it's being able to create your plans and then to execute those plans with your team of people at exactly the right time that you need to in order to deliver a successful outcome. And so I think they're the three things that I would take away and talk about in a leadership workshop.
It's interesting you say that because we always use that term. It was just a sense of timing was perfect. How often do we use that in terms of our projects, our business opportunities? Timing, it's all about timing. That's a great leadership lesson.
I agree. And I think that perfect timing comes down to those plans that you've made and executing your plans at the right time that you need to. And it's, as we were talking about before, it's doing what we say that we'll do.
David, this has been a great conversation. We travelled from the fog-covered fields of Austerlitz to the realities of modern leadership and project delivery. Now, what stands out to me is how timeless some of these principles are. Clarity of intent, preparation, reading the environment, and having the courage to act decisively when the moment arrives. David, thank you for bringing such depth and personal insight into the discussion. It's been a pleasure exploring this with you. I just want to ask you, if someone were to visit Austerlitz, make it all the way to that wonderful place, what tip would you have for them, apart from not taking your kids?
I think there's two things. The first thing is, as I mentioned, the battlefield is quite a large battlefield. And so you need a lot of time to explore it properly. So we probably spent the better part of a day exploring the battlefield. If I was to return again and give people a tip on exploring the battlefield, I would say maybe give yourself 2 days to explore the battlefield because it's quite a large battlefield. There's a museum in the middle of the battlefield that we didn't get a chance to go to because it was closed by the time we got there. And so, yes, that would be my first tip. The second tip that I've got is that I have a really great guidebook which gives a lot of insights and background knowledge into the battle and the different parts of the battlefield and really helped to guide us around the battlefield as we were moving around the battlefild, driving in a hire car that we had. So yeah, my two tips would be give yourself a lot of time, and the second one would be take a guidebook with you. And in particular, the guidebook that I was using was really great, and that will really help to enhance your experience when you're traveling around through that part of Europe.
Well, in closing, to our listeners, thank you for joining us. I'm David, and this is Historical Projects, a community podcast exploring projects and lessons. Until next time.